Bueno, muy buenas tardes para todos y todas y un saludo especial desde la República Dominicana en nombre de la Escuela Nacional de la Judicatura del Poder Judicial Dominicano. Sean bienvenidos al diálogo sobre inteligencia artificial que tendremos esta tarde con el profesor Linna, quien es profesor de la Universidad de Northwestern de Estados Unidos, a quien aprovechamos para saludar y agradecerle la aceptación de nuestra invitación. Este es el segundo diálogo que realizamos en el marco del Laboratorio de Innovación para la Justicia de la Escuela Nacional de la Judicatura, Lab ENJ, iniciativa creada con el propósito de innovar para mejorar la justicia, crear nuevos servicios que solucionen los problemas de los ciudadanos y generar conocimiento que permita innovar en la profesión del derecho. Permítanme de inmediato presentarles un breve perfil académico del profesor Linna, que van a ver en pantalla a continuación. El profesor Linna, como adelantaba, es profesor de la Universidad de Northwestern, Estados Unidos. Es director de iniciativas de Derecho y Tecnología y profesor titular de esta misma universidad. Posee una licenciatura en Derecho, magna cum laude, de la Facultad de Derecho de la Universidad de Michigan y una maestría en Políticas Públicas y Administración en la Universidad Estatal de Michigan. Su enseñanza e investigación está centrada en la innovación y la tecnología, incluyendo el derecho computacional, la inteligencia artificial, el análisis de datos, el liderazgo, las operaciones y los marcos de innovación. Es miembro del cuerpo docente de Codex, el Centro de Informática Legal de la Universidad de Stanford, Estados Unidos. Se unió a la Universidad de Northwestern como profesor visitante de la Facultad de Derecho de la Universidad Estatal de Michigan, donde fue profesor de Derecho, director y fundador del Centro de Innovación en Servicios Legales, Legal R&D. El profesor Linna es cofundador del Grupo de Encuentro de Innovación Legal y Tecnología de Chicago, cofundador y codirector del Instituto para el Futuro de la Práctica Jurídica y presidente del Comité de Análisis Legal de la Sección de Derecho Comercial de la American Bar Association, ABA. Quiero aprovechar para saludar a José Torres, quien está con nosotros y es asesor de nuestro Laboratorio de Innovación para la Justicia, Lab ENJ, y también saludar a la magistrada Vicky Chalas, que está con nosotros. Ella es jueza del segundo juzgado de la instrucción de la Romana, egresada de una maestría en género en la London School of Economics, y estará con nosotros luego de la participación del profesor Linna moderando la sesión de preguntas y respuestas, y al finalizar tendrá a su cargo también las palabras de cierre. Este evento cuenta con traducción simultánea del idioma inglés al español. Por tanto, de inmediato quiero invitarles a hacer clic, si no lo han hecho, al icono de interpretación en la aplicación de Zoom y seleccionar el idioma español para que puedan seguir la conferencia que a continuación dictará el profesor Linna. Esperamos sinceramente que puedan aprovechar esta valiosa oportunidad de escuchar al profesor Linna y que puedan formular interesantes preguntas para enriquecer el diálogo sobre este tema interesante y retador para el mundo de la justicia, al que no escapan nuestros poderes judiciales iberoamericanos. Reiteradas gracias al profesor Linna por aceptar nuestra invitación. Le dejamos con él para iniciar este diálogo sobre inteligencia artificial. Buenas tardes, profesor Linna, desde el Caribe, desde la República Dominicana. Muchas gracias. Adelante.
Talk about improving access to justice and how we might use technology. And in doing so, I want to spend a little bit of time trying to demystify artificial intelligence, kind of explain, well, what is it and how does it work? So I'm going to let me get started here. We see computational technologies changing everything. They're having an impact on all sorts of different things in our daily lives. And what we really see is that there's a digital world emerging around us. But you know, in the legal world, and before I joined academia, I was a practicing lawyer for over a decade. What we see in law is that today law, in many ways, is still pretty much the same as what it was over 100 years ago. Our law offices, our courtrooms are still pretty much doing things in very much the same ways. And while there's this digital world emerging around us, we're still working in this analog world with paper, for example. And this has some costs. And my home state where I grew up and I started my legal career and my teaching career in Michigan, the Chief Justice, Bridget McCormick there, is leading a lot of digital transformation and using technology. And she talks about how this COVID-19 pandemic that we've all faced around the world just made it even more apparent that in our justice systems, there's a lack of technology and we have archaic rules and processes. So it's not just that our technology, even where we have technology, is outdated from the last century, but that we have outdated rules and processes for this new digital age. And this creates problems all around the world. We have a justice gap, over 5 billion people deprived of justice in all different forms. This is a big problem here in the US as well, a very wealthy country, where the estimates are that about 80% of the impoverished and about half of the middle class lack access to legal services. This isn't just individuals. Even many businesses lack access to the services that they need. And so the question that I have is that with this digital world emerging around us, where many people have a supercomputer in their pocket, a smartphone, can we reimagine justice being something different? Can we think of a world where everyone would have access to legal information and basic legal services? And so here come the robot lawyers, right? Now, that's the memes and the headlines, the clickbait headlines you might see on social media talking about artificial intelligence and robotic lawyers. And so what I want to kind of do during this talk is talk a little bit about the technology, which is very powerful. It can do some very interesting things, but also demystify it to help understand, well, what is it that goes into creating artificial intelligence? And then as we get towards the end of my talk, I want to talk a little bit about technology is very powerful and it's going to have a big impact on the practice of law and courts and the way we think about the rule of law. But we need to think about other components. We really need to think about transformation in terms of people, process, data, and technology. So just starting with, first of all, well, what is artificial intelligence? And sometimes people will debate how we should define artificial intelligence. They might say some technologies are artificial intelligence or are not. But I think what's best is just to have a general definition. It's just intelligence demonstrated by machines. The most important thing to understand is that when people talk about artificial intelligence, it is not any one thing. There are many different forms of artificial intelligence. And I'm going to talk a little bit about just expert systems even, and this is considered rules-driven artificial intelligence. So delivering solutions with more like formal logic. And what you hear a lot of hype about today is machine learning, right? And I'm going to talk a little bit about what that is. And there's different forms of machine learning. Natural language processing, how do machines understand language? And there are very, very powerful tools that have been emerging in that space. And these are very useful in law because in law, we have lots of words. We're surrounded by language everywhere we look in law. And natural language processing is what helps us understand those words. Then there are other tools that aren't used quite as much in the legal space, like vision and speech or planning and robotics. But the important takeaway here is that artificial intelligence isn't any one thing. And so if someone says to you that they want to use artificial intelligence or you should use artificial intelligence in the courts, an important first question is, well, what kind of artificial intelligence? What do you mean? Now, the other thing I would like to talk about is different phases of artificial intelligence, because sometimes we talk about artificial intelligence like robot terminators, right? This super general intelligence, that robots and AI that will be exceed the capabilities of humans in every dimension. When people talk about things like that, they're generally talking about something more like artificial general intelligence, like the intelligence that a human has. Like if I'm a child and I see a dog, maybe a couple of examples of a dog, and as a human, I'm very good at applying that knowledge to other examples. If I see a much larger dog, I can probably infer that that is actually a dog. But machines don't work that way, at least the ones that we have right now. They have much narrower AI. And so they're generally skilled at one specific task. So you might have a smartphone in your pocket, and you might be able to say something to it, and it can turn that language into words. Can do a lot of other really interesting things with the artificial intelligence in it. But you can't get it to learn new tasks on its own. It's very narrow. It only understands what we've really explicitly programmed and trained it to learn. Okay? So that's something important. And now sometimes people talk about artificial general intelligence like very bullish people on AI like Ray Kurzweil may say, it's 10, 20 years away and we'll have artificial general intelligence, these machines that can learn how to learn in one domain and apply it in another. But some people say it might be never, or it might be 10,000 years before we would have AI like that, or it might require 100 Nobel Prize breakthroughs. So the important thing to realize, though, is that we've got basically narrow AI right now, and we're not sure if we'll ever have anything like artificial general intelligence. You might hear people talk about algorithms. These are the foundation for artificial intelligence. And technologists might talk about algorithms in a very sophisticated way, make it sound opaque and difficult to understand. But really, an algorithm is as basic as a recipe. You can look in the bottom left of this slide here, and I have a recipe for making a chocolate cake. So you think about it, you need to know the ingredients, the inputs, what goes into your algorithm. How does the algorithm process the information? And then what sort of outcome will you get? In the case of a chocolate cake, you take the flour, the chocolate, the eggs, you mix that all together, you put it in the pan, you bake it at a certain temperature, and you know you'll get a cake at the end. It's an algorithm, right? It's a recipe for solving a problem or accomplishing some end. So if you understand that, you understand the basics of what an algorithm is and how that goes into artificial intelligence. Now, what we see in law generally today are two types of artificial intelligence. There's rules-driven artificial intelligence, mostly expert systems, like thinking through logic, if-then sort of logic to provide advice or create documents. And then there's data-driven artificial intelligence. So using machine learning in large data sets. So I'm going to just walk through each of these examples. So TurboTax is a common example used for a rules-driven system, a tool that can help individuals create their tax return to pay their taxes to the US. Well, how does a tool, an expert system like this work? Well, basically, you have a technologist or a knowledge engineer, as created in this picture, and they work with the human expert, right? So if I'm in this picture, this is depicting a doctor. I would work to the knowledge engineer and say, well, these are the questions I ask. These are the inputs I need, right? Think about that algorithm. This is how I process the information, and this is how I produce an output. So you can think about just like giving legal advice. If you talk to a lawyer, like, well, what are the questions you ask the individual? How do you process those questions to provide advice or to create a document that might be filed with a court or so on? That's how a basic rules-driven system works. And so here in the US, if I said, okay, I have a statute, or this is actually a regulation, deferred action on childhood arrivals, a letter ruling on it. And we put things in statutes and walls of words frequently, but if I think, well, what if I could create a flow chart? And I could look at all the different inputs and ask, how do I process them so that I can provide an output? I can give advice, or I could create a document. That's a big step towards creating a technology tool, a rules-driven AI tool to provide advice or create documents. And we see more and more tools like these emerging around the globe. This is an example here from Chicago. It's a chatbot called Rentervention. And so how does it work? Well, it asks questions. and the tenants can put in information just about its scenario, where they live, what kind of problem they're experiencing. And chatbots like this can help give people advice about how to work with their landlord, for example, help them understand their rights, help them understand their obligations, help them create a response to a court eviction action, and things like that. And we see more and more uses of tools like this, including some that are created by courts, different toolkits to help self-represented individuals understand their rights and obligations and respond to different actions in courts. Here's another example from Illinois Legal Aid Online for security deposits to get your security deposit back as a tenant. Here's an example from Michigan Legal Help about a divorce matter with children involved. So we're seeing more and more of these tools created, right, in this chatbot form, this question and answer form. Here's one. This company Do Not Pay has created what they call a robot lawyer that helps people fight parking tickets. There's even a company called LegalZoom that is operating in many countries. And in the US, actually, it's the #1 incorporator of businesses in the state of California. So an example of providing legal services this way. Even large international law firms are creating expert systems. Here's an example from Reed Smith, where they've created an expert system, a technology tool to help individuals, companies, businesses who've had a data breach incident. It helps them understand what the law is in the applicable jurisdictions, what sort of notifications they need to provide to their customers and relevant government officials. The Wilson Sonsini law firm in the US created an app for people to be able to comply with the California Consumer Privacy Act. And we're seeing big law firms now use these tools to also generate revenue, to provide substantive advice, to provide value to their clients, and then generate revenue. So those are rules-driven systems. And we've got many, many forms of these that are basic document automation and tools to provide basic advice and information to consumers and end users. A lot of what you also, though, hear about is data-driven artificial intelligence. So using tools like machine learning and deep learning. And these are probabilistic statistical models. Okay? And now you might hear people talk about these sometimes as supervised or unsupervised. And basically what supervised means is there are humans there who label data, label the examples, and tell the machine what it is the machine is looking at. So for one example on categorical machine learning, you can think of spam in your emails. And if you use Google Mail, for example, Gmail or other popular email providers, those systems are very good at identifying spam. How is it that they're so good? Well, they have millions of examples, and these examples have been labeled as either spam, the stuff you don't want, or ham, the good stuff, right? So if you use Gmail, it'll move emails into the spam folder, and you can even keep training the system, and it keeps learning. You can tell it, this is not spam. This should not have been moved to the spam filter. And so there are millions, billions of examples even now of email, and we've trained these systems with these examples of what a good email looks like and what a spam email looks like. And now Google has said that its AI spam filter is 99.9% accurate. Okay, so that's a good example. And if you think about it, in law, there are times when we just need to understand how to classify information. Is this relevant or is this not relevant? And so that's a lot like a spam filter. There are other examples that we can draw on, like tools to predict the value of a house, for example. How does that work? What is the labeling there? Well, some human has put together data, such as here, calculating information about the square footage of a home and how that helps predict what the price is. So you can plot a line of best fit, linear regression. Some of you who had stats classes remember linear regression and other algorithms like that. And once you have that model, if you have a new home that comes up and you know the square footage, you can make a prediction about what the price is. And so predictions like this can be really helpful, and they're happening everywhere outside of law, and they're starting to happen more and more inside of law as well. If you go to a website to buy a book, Artificial intelligence is used to recommend other books to you. How is that done? Well, the website knows information about you, and it knows information about other people. And then based on what other people do, artificial intelligence makes recommendations to you. Same thing for watching movies online, right? So there's a lot of data, and there's comparisons made, and then recommendations made. Now, we've seen in the legal space, particularly in countries that have discovery in civil law systems, where much of the work that lawyers did to review documents and determine if they were relevant or not relevant is now done by technology-assisted review. So we're using AI to review those documents and identify which ones are relevant, which ones are important, like the ham stuff, versus the spam, the emails and other documents that we don't want. That same sort of technology has been applied in diligence, looking at contracts. If a business is purchasing another business, to look at the target company's contracts in the diligence process, and also for contract review. We've also been seeing tools that can automate the drafting of initial papers to be filed in a court. So the response to a lawsuit that's been filed, or creating discovery requests or responding to discovery requests. Now, this transformation that is happening is not just limited to lawyers and the way they do their work and legal aid organizations. Courts are also changing in the way that they use technology. And a really great example is the British Columbia Civil Resolution Tribunal. And what the Civil Resolution Tribunal does is they've created a system that the litigants are routed through the system, they're led through the system down a path to try to reach an agreement to resolve their dispute. So this is a complete redesign in the sense that courts generally are focused on adjudication, right? We're going to tell one party they're right and one party they're wrong, and everything is really kind of focused around that for the most part. But with this Civil Resolution Tribunal, it's a new tribunal. And there's not focus on adjudication, but getting the parties to an amicable agreement, something they can agree with. And another thing that's very interesting about these courts, the Civil Resolution Tribunal, is there are no lawyers allowed. So there are no lawyers in this system. And the jurisdiction for these disputes continues to increase. It started with condominium disputes, and now it includes small claims and motor vehicle injury disputes. So this is a good example of how some courts are changing. We've seen quite a few new companies now that are working with courts to provide online dispute resolution systems. And many of them are starting with things like traffic tickets and minor like warrants and pleas, but many of them are moving to larger and larger items like landlord-tenant disputes. Matterhorn is another one of them. And Modria. Modria is interesting because it started with eBay, resolving disputes between people on eBay. And if you are a fan of online courts, you've probably heard about Richard Susskind, who has done quite a bit of writing in this space. He's written a book, and there's been huge investment in the United Kingdom around using online courts and using technology to improve access to justice. And one of the reasons why we're seeing this discussed is the ways to change how courts do things is thinking about how AI could be used to increase the speed at which cases could be heard. So in many countries, there's huge backlogs of cases. Some countries are worse than others. But the idea is, how might we use artificial intelligence tools to understand which cases are the ones that ought to be expedited or can be the easy decisions or that will have the most impact as far as setting precedent, things like that. And so just last month, there was an article in the ABA Journal in the US here talking about Brazil's Superior Court of Justice and its use of Victor, a tool that it uses to address the backlog in petitions. And according to a 2017 Brazilian Federal Supreme Court Activity Report, the court has since issued 126,000 decisions and registered its lowest final collection of pending cases of the last 5 years. And so it says that this Victor tool reduces the initial analysis of petitions from 30 minutes to 5 seconds. So greatly speeding up the decision process in that case. Now, there's even been a lot of discussion about AI being used as a judge in court. And now, for the most part, this maybe is clickbait headlines, big headlines about it, and that's less of what's being focused on. But I think it's really important to think about why these questions are being asked about how technology can be used, because we have biases in current court systems and asking, how can data, how can technology help improve the transparency and the effectiveness and the fairness and justice in our court systems? So it's a famous example of studying judges. Daniel Kahneman studied Israeli parole boards to find out how their rulings, and he properly randomized everything. And he found that these parole boards, they had some bias in their decisions. And that is that if a petition came before them before a meal break, right, they were hungry, they didn't grant the petition. And so by using data, we can identify biases like these. We can help better understand what's going on in the courts, and we can make sure that we have processes and systems that are fair and just for everyone. Here in the US, we've got plenty of examples like this as well. Some of them are very troubling, different issues of bias. An example of some of the bias, just one example of many that we could point out, are just the chances of getting asylum. And so some people have said that using technology in courts can help improve the consistency of decisions across the different courts. So if you look at the data about the chances of getting asylum in courts in the US, it's very different from one court to the next. And this is all applying the same federal law. Now you might say, well, maybe there's different kinds of cases in Atlanta or Detroit versus New York and San Francisco. But when we use data and we look at a particular district, like Houston, for example, here, we see huge differences in the grants versus denials. And these are random assignments of cases. So we see bias in these decisions where one judge may be granting asylum 30% of the time, and another judge is only granting 3 or 4% of the time. And it's not just Houston, it's New York, where we see huge variations, and Los Angeles, right? So this is happening everywhere where we have bias in what's actually happening in the courts right now. Now, it's true that introducing technology can also cause us to exacerbate bias, to make it worse, bias that's already in our criminal justice and our justice system. And in the US, there was a study, the ProPublica study, that looked about algorithms for predicting recidivism, the likelihood of committing future crimes. And it found that there were some problems in the fairness with that. Now, one of the really interesting things here is that these tools that were used to predict recidivism were originally not intended to make those predictions. They were intended to make predictions about what sort of interventions might help people the most. So I think it's a really important question that we should ask. Like, if we're going to use technology, for what purpose? What are our goals? What are our values in the legal system? How do we make sure that our usage of technology is consistent with our values and goals? Could we use technology like this in a better way to help us figure out better how to help people and get the best out of people, rather than making these predictions about the likelihood to commit a crime? I think those are important questions. But it's also important to recognize that our current justice systems have biases, and our algorithms do not necessarily need to be perfect to improve our current justice system. We have to set the right baseline, right? What do things look like now? And can technology help us do better than that? And that's why many researchers said, well, biased technology is a concern. In many ways, biased algorithms are easier to fix than biased people. And that's why you continue still to hear people talk about this idea of judges that can pass sentence with no human bias in the AI. Now, again, some of this may be science fiction to a great extent, because there's so many opportunities to think about how to use technology with humans, right? Humans plus the machines. How can technology augment what humans do? But there are areas where we may think about technology standing in different ways, and humans being there to kind of handle the appeals or monitor what's happening. I wanted to take just a second to talk about some research that I did about perceptions of AI in the courts, large law firms. And I think it's important to talk about this just because sometimes people say, well, this is just hype, this is not really happening. But when you talk to large law firms, they have a lot of incentive to be very level-headed in their thinking about how technology is going to be used. And so when I asked with Thomson Reuters, I asked these large law firms in the UK and the US about the value of contract management. These are tools to automatically review contracts, automate the drafting of contracts, and then help with the management and storage of contracts. An overwhelming majority of people said they were at least somewhat valuable, with nearly half of the people saying they were very or extremely valuable. And then when we asked them about the future of AI for drafting contracts, reviewing contracts, and managing contracts, all of them, right? It's only 25 people in this portion of the survey, but all of them said it's at least somewhat important, and well more than half said very or extremely important. The same thing when I asked them about AI in litigation, in disputes, drafting automation, an overwhelming majority said it was at least somewhat valuable. And when I asked about the future, none of them said it wasn't important. They all said it was at least somewhat important, with nearly half people saying it was very or extremely important. So this to me brings me to this question. There's this worry sometimes about, oh, technology is going to replace lawyers, right? And I don't think this is something that lawyers should be worrying about. We should think about what the future looks like and think the many ways in which humans can add value, can help people, can solve problems that machines can't come anywhere near solving, right? There's abundant opportunities for lawyers to add great value. But we have to also recognize the ways in which technology can help us do some of the things that lawyers and courts and others do right now. And so, for example, Altman Weil asked lawyers in 2015 about whether they thought IBM Watson, you may have seen this, IBM Watson won the quiz show Jeopardy, right? So this famous example of a computer beating humans at this quiz game. Well, they had asked this survey twice. And in 2011, nearly 46% of people said computers will never replace human practitioners. But by 2015, after people saw the example of IBM Watson, they had only 20% said that. And so it was kind of a change where people started realizing that, well, there are some tasks like the review of documents that computers can do. And so those are some tasks that would be replaced. And then there was a study that looked at billing data from attorneys. What are the attorneys doing and what could actually be replaced with machines? And what was interesting about this study is they looked closely at this billing data, the lawyer's recording of hours, and they found that it was only relatively structured and repetitive tasks that could be automated. And they found that was not a large percentage of lawyers' billable hours. Now, but what I want to ask is, why is legal work unstructured like that? Can we figure out how to improve our business model, how to have standards and best practices for the way we deliver law and legal information to people? And can we measure that? Can we measure the quality of justice? Can we measure the quality of legal advice? And if we better understand how we do things in courts and in the provision of legal advice, can we improve legal services? And so what I'm suggesting is that although some things we do as lawyers and judges and legal professionals is like art, a lot of it can be like science or engineering. So how do we bring rigor like scientists and engineers do to our delivery of legal services? And this brings me to the point that the way the industry is changing is not just AI, but it's really people, process, data, and technology. When you think about people, we need more people with new skills. We need lawyers who understand technology, who understand data and statistics and project management and design thinking. We also need new kinds of professionals in the legal industry, in our courts, in our law firms, in our legal aid organizations. We need people with leadership and management and listening, coaching, counseling, and empathy skills, and process data and technology skills. So we need to upskill our lawyers and other professionals, and we need to train our next generations of lawyers and legal professionals in these skills. And so what we really need are T-shaped lawyers. This idea that it used to be a lawyer or a judge, right? You have deep substantive legal expertise, kind of this vertical part of the T. And more what we're looking for, we want people who have skills across, not the depth necessarily, but an understanding of data analytics, artificial intelligence, project management, process improvement, business, right? New skills in legal operations that will help us improve courts, legal services delivery, and the legal industry generally. And when I talk about legal technology, it's more than just advanced things like AI, artificial, the shiny objects. There's things like document automation and expert systems using basic technologies, but then also knowing how to use our tools for creating documents like Microsoft Word and Excel, understanding metadata and e-discovery, how to use the cloud. So a lot of basics around technology. And then data, right? Data, there's an explosion in big data, lots of talk about big data and how that works with artificial intelligence. But we should also start thinking about small data. How do we create metrics? How do we measure? Do we have satisfaction information from people going to the courts or coming to our law firms to get services? How do we create benchmarks for efficiency and quality? And then the last thing I want to talk about in the people, process, data, technology is process. And so how can we understand our processes, our ways of doing things? Can we use human-centered design and lean thinking? The processes, the way we do things, they may be different, they may vary, but they consist of similar components. And we understand that, we can perfect those processes. We can turn this into more of a scientific endeavor. We can agree on standards and best practices on how to do things. And some law firms have made great progress doing this, and courts as well, mapping their processes. How are things done from beginning to end? This is a map of a litigation matter from the Seyfarth Shaw law firm. So mapping out each step in a litigation, the documents related to it, and how those work. I want to show a specific concrete example of how when I was in Michigan, we worked with a court there, the 55th District Court. And here are the judges we worked with, Judge Boyd and Judge Allen. And here's the team of students and faculty, and we worked very closely with the judges and the court clerks in the 55th District Court in Mason, Michigan. And we went in and we ran a lean process improvement event. We spent a full week there, and we were looking at landlord-tenant matters and how can we improve the service provided to the people coming to the court. How can we make the court work better for them? And we had a view on the long term to be able to use technology. But first, we had to start with the foundation of really just understanding the processes and how the court worked. So one thing we did is we went in and we created what these are called spaghetti diagrams. So we mapped each person when they came in. Where did they go? What did they do? And by doing that, we understood basically, did people know where they were going when they came into the court? Did they know where they needed to go? We found out that a lot of people didn't. So it helped us think about maybe signage and what could we improve to help people understand where they need to go to feel more comfortable and confident to be able to get where they needed to go. We mapped the landlord-tenant litigation process. What does it look like? What is each step in the proceeding? Where are the pain points for the people going through the process? Where are the opportunities to improve? And it's really interesting because what you do is you get everyone in the room for one of these mapping exercises. These are the court clerks there. So we'd have the court clerks, the administrative team, the judges, everyone working together to map the process and understand better how it works. And we put it on the wall, right? Making it visual. And then everyone can look at it and we can say, is that how it works? Is that how it plays out? So we can have better understanding of how the processes really work. And then we proposed solutions, interventions, how we thought might improve things, and we got buy-in from everyone on the team. And then we immediately implemented them, right, in a very lean fashion, not waiting for months. We identified where there was some confusion by people coming to the court, and we tried an intervention that we could just put up on the wall on a Post-it to help people understand something that they had been struggling with. And the other thing we did is we collected data before about the types of problems that were happening. In this case, it was people who were confused. They were asking questions of the court clerks. They didn't know what to do. So we did that before the intervention and then after the intervention so that we could understand how this could actually help people and whether it had an impact. Did things improve when we made a change? I did a similar project for a different district court in Lansing, Michigan. I worked on that one with Margaret Hagan, who is at the Stanford Design Lab. And there, another thing that we did is that we realized we are giving attorneys to people who needed an attorney, tenants and landlord-tenant disputes. And we had to send out a paper to people with the original complaint to help them understand what they were getting. And so we created lots of different versions of this. And we went to the court and we did user testing. We showed it to people. What would you do if you received this? Okay, what would you think? What is this for? And we would listen to them. We'd understand, well, do they get it? Or are they seeing what we think they ought to see? Do they understand what to do? And we did many iterations of that and improved it to a final version and then kept testing. And we're seeing more and more courts that are using lean systems thinking, design thinking to improve what they're doing and improve legal services delivery. So that's really the foundation for being able to apply technology and artificial intelligence in courts and in legal services delivery. And so if this sounds interesting to you, I'd really encourage you to think about Toyota way. The Toyota systems thinking is something that is a great foundation for doing this. You might have heard of this idea, fail fast, right? If you want to be an innovator, you need to be able to fail fast, some say. And sometimes lawyers don't like hearing that, this idea of fail fast. And I think the idea that you want to get across is you want to learn fast. When we're trying to innovate, we don't know the answers. We have to avoid conclusions. We can't jump to conclusions. We can't make assumptions. We have to test our ideas. That's this whole idea of learning fast. And so applying some of these lean startup ideas, there are more and more people writing about it, like this book by Ann Chung on lean impact, another great book for thinking about more for social good using process improvement. And this idea of thinking big, start small, start where we can, think big, start small, and then keep relentlessly seeking impact. So there's a lot of different methodologies. One of the key things to keep in mind that so many of these things that when we're the lawyer or if we're in a court, we sometimes just think about what we're doing. And of course, all this is about thinking about our customers, our users, the people who come to the court. We're there to serve them. It's human-centered and we think about them and their journey through the process. That is one of the keys to thinking about all these different design thinking, lean thinking, agile, improvement kata, and so on. And then the other thing is oftentimes we think about innovation, about just being creative, and we need the most creative people to come up with the best ideas. And brainstorming and coming up with ideas is important, but what's even more important is having the discipline so that we know when we test our ideas and we can learn from that, whether we're implementing artificial intelligence and other kind of technology or just improving processes. How do we do that in a disciplined way so that we can learn from the experiments we try? And that's particularly important in a judiciary where you can try experiments in different areas. And Some things might work in one court, but not in another. But how do we do it in a disciplined way so we can learn from each other, from the experiments that each of us is conducting in different areas? And that's really the key to innovation. And so I just challenge us, right? Artificial intelligence, technology, there are abundant opportunities for us to improve the legal services that we deliver as lawyers and other legal professionals, to improve legal institutions, governments, legislatures, courts, and also to improve the law itself. The law itself will continue to transform as we go more further and further into this digital world. But there's abundant opportunities for lawyers and other technologists to use technology to improve justice for everyone. And still plenty of big problems for lawyers to solve in the world. We shouldn't worry about technology replacing lawyers. That's not going to happen. There's going to be tasks that technology will be more and more capable to do, and then it'll allow us as lawyers and judges and other legal professionals to do more and more in the world and to deliver greater fairness, greater justice, and to do well by doing good for others and improving legal services, legal systems, and the law. So that's all I had, and I'd encourage you to check out the information that I have in this space. Writing, I have a blog, I've done research on many of these topics, and I'm also on Twitter, if any of you might happen to be there. And with that, I'm also going to just pause my screen sharing so that we can go to the question and answer portion of the program.
Thank you very much, Professor Linna. Muchas gracias. Please remember to put the translation in English for us to tell you the questions in Spanish. Muchas gracias al profesor Dan Linna por la excelente conferencia que nos expone lo que está sucediendo.
Dr. Linna, for this conference, allowing us to understand what's going on.
Muchísimas gracias al profesor Linna por su excelente conferencia que nos expone lo que está sucediendo en el mundo del derecho y la justicia.
What's going on in the justice world. And as I said in my introduction, let me give the word to Vicky Chalas. She's a judge of the second judge in La Romana. She has a master's degree in gender from the London Studies. She's going to be in charge of voicing the questions that have been written down in the chat box. She's going to give the opportunity to anyone who wants to ask a question through the microphone. Thank you, Vicky Chalas. She will have the final words as well. Welcome, Vicky.
Oh, me?
Muchísimas gracias, director. I would like
Thank you, Director.
as well. Thank you for joining us in this space and sharing important knowledge about artificial intelligence. Now we are on the Q&A session. As the director said, if anyone has any question, they can just raise their hand, and you will be given the word to speak through the microphone. We already have a few questions written, so I will just give like a few seconds to see if anyone wants to raise their hand and make a question. Okay, no one has raised their hands yet.
Magistrada, sí hay una participación que está en el usuario de Secretaría Técnica de Panamá, que tiene la mano levantada y le van a habilitar el micrófono.
We have a question from Panama. We're going to hear it through the microphone. Yes.
Bueno, le estamos solicitando la posibilidad de que habilite su micrófono, pero no es posible por el momento, así que procedemos entonces a instalar con las preguntas escritas por el momento, y si alguien luego quiere habilitar.
Apparently, the person that's going to ask the question
Hi.
is having technical issues with this
Hi
microphone.
there.
Oh, okay.
Sorry, the prompt didn't appear on time. My name's Frank. I'm from Panama, from Secretaría Técnica de Modernización. And I have a question for Dr. Linna. What are your thoughts on implementing AI to categorize cases and documents in a paper-based justice system? Should there be a direct jump from that, like the situation we saw in Brazil, or should we invest in text recognition software first? Is the money better invested in phasing out paper quicker?
That's a good question. And I mean, I think the starting point for so many of these questions is to really be clear about, well, what is the problem we're aiming to solve, right? How do we think technology might help improve, might be the solution? What can it do for us? And I think that's really such an important place to start, is to really just understand what is the problem. And that'll help really kind of guide to thinking about where to start first. I think there are some problems with optical character recognition. Even that solution is going to be challenging when you're trying to recognize paper documents. It's not going to be perfect, most likely, and maybe it doesn't need to be perfect, but again, it depends what problem you're trying to solve. And because that will help you figure out if you can use the technology the way you want to with optical character recognition. I would have a strong bias in favor of trying to get to a position where documents are filed, all filings are digital, because then of course, if they're digital, you don't have to worry about optical character recognition. They're already in your system. So you'll have accurate, perfect data in that sense. So that would be my bias, is to say, my preference is to say, attempt to create, to get to that point as soon as possible where you can have digital records, digital documents. But again, it really depends on what problem are you trying to solve, and definitely optical character recognition and looking at documents is good enough and can be fairly highly accurate that it can help you solve different problems without a doubt.
Thank you for that question. The next question we have is, how could the Dominican Republic start introducing legal technology in courts?
Yeah, I think that is a really good question. And there are, I think there are lots of pilots that have been started in many courts around the world now. And I would love to see more and more discussion of the opportunities to learn from other courts. I think it's so important to establish goals and understand in each jurisdiction, like what is the highest priority, right? What is most important? And some of the examples I was shown earlier, it might be by providing information and help to individual users of the justice system, where there can be a lot of help provided, because of course there are many situations where it would be better if, instead of having to come to court, people perhaps understood the law and their rights and their obligations, and maybe they can work out their problem themselves, right? Maybe it's something that it's just not having the information they need about the law and how things would work out if they did go to the court. We're seeing, though, more and more tools, like I talked about British Columbia, the Civil Resolution Tribunal. Are there areas of law where we can help free up, resolve lower level disputes, or even traffic tickets or warrants, things like that? And there's been some study, for example, from J.J. Prescott looking at technology platforms used in courts. I don't think he has good enough data to show direct causation, but some of what it seems like what might be going on is that if you're in a court and you can use technology, maybe with even asynchronous hearings or just online technology so people can take care of other proceedings like traffic tickets, that the court will then have more time available for the individuals in the court to spend more time on those matters where you really need humans to help do the work. Right? So I think that, again, it depends so much just on the local, where do you think is the biggest pain point? But there are a lot of opportunities for different sorts of proceedings. I think especially because of COVID-19, more and more courts are asking, well, do we really need people to come to the court? Are there things that they can do, on their cell phone? Does it need to be real time, synchronous, right? Do we have to talk at the same time? Or can we create a system that the judge puts in information in the morning and the person logs on at night and puts in the response, right? So I think there's a lot of opportunities to be creative on it, but it really depends so much in different jurisdictions. Where do they think is the best opportunity to get started? Oh, I think.
Sorry. Thank you for your answer, Professor. Now we have Jocelyn Voss.
Hola, muy buenas tardes. Muchísimas gracias. Súper interesante la conferencia.
Thank you. Really interesting, the conference. Thank you, Professor Linna.
Tecnología es ampliamente
Obviously, the use of this technology is very beneficial in the administration of justice and jurisdiction topics, but I would like to know your experience in the development of the concept of the ethics within. How do you use the ethics in the development
y
of the
utilizando inteligencia artificial
technology
y además de ello,
using
pues,
AI, sorry,
que el balance que debe existir
this
es
balance that should exist between the protection of personal data and the use of artificial intelligence. As you said, you can have a bias while developing the tool because it's biased because of their culture or other aspects. Can you talk, please, a bit about this? Thank you.
Yes. The ethics of artificial intelligence is a very important question. And we need to think very carefully about how we use technology and data and artificial intelligence in legal systems, in courts. We also need to think very carefully. There are also big opportunities to think about opportunities for creating law. What are the laws that should apply to artificial intelligence? And we're seeing the European Union actually just last month announce some regulations, their proposed regulations. They already have the GDPR on privacy, and many jurisdictions are putting in laws similar to that. But now there's been more and more lawmaking around how should we regulate the use of artificial intelligence. And there's some guiding principles around this. I think this question highlights why it's so important for lawyers, for judges, for other legal professionals to understand how artificial intelligence works. Because otherwise, it's going to be very difficult to have meaningful conversations about the ethics of artificial intelligence and make sure that the data is not biased, or at least understanding the biases in the data and in our current systems. And when we talk about artificial intelligence being biased, a lot of times it's kind of like just holding up a mirror, right? Because if we say, oh, well, we created artificial intelligence where there's a famous example, Amazon created artificial intelligence for hiring, for reviewing resumes. And they found that there was bias. It was the gender bias. It was not, it was discriminating against women in the hiring. And so in a way, that's like holding up a mirror. We see our past practices and now it's being reflected in these algorithms. So how do we make sure that we understand that, we can monitor that? And there are more and more principles emerging for thinking about when we use data. This isn't just AI either, by the way, right? It's algorithms generally. You can have an algorithm that is very simple that you use Microsoft Excel or even on paper, right? Kind of like check the boxes and it tells you what the outcome is in administration. And that can be very biased as well. but we're coming up with more and more processes to understand so that we can think about the best practices for how do we design the algorithms, how do we implement them so that we make sure they're being used properly and for the purpose for which they're intended, and then how do we validate them? How do we test them? How do we measure to see where there might be biases and where people could potentially be harmed? Privacy legislation is a good example because I think we've got much more robust understanding of privacy and how to protect people's privacy. And one of the bedrock principles there is privacy by design. You can't have technologists or other people build something and then you think about privacy at the end afterwards. No, from day one, you need to think about privacy. Same thing here. We can't just say, oh, technologists, build us something for the court system. No, we need to be there. We need to think about justice and bias and ethics from day one. It needs to be part of that whole process. And to be able to do that effectively as lawyers and as judges, we need to understand we need to have a functional understanding of artificial intelligence. What is it? So when someone says, oh, it uses AI, we can't say, oh, I don't know now. I don't know what to ask, right? We have to be able to say, well, tell me more. What kind of AI? Where did the data come from? How have you tested and validated your model, right? We have to be engaged. And we need to encourage other people to be engaged. We need to encourage the public and others to learn about these tools and be engaged in the process of thinking about how we can use technology for social good, to better serve, to meet the goals and to be consistent with the values we have, particularly in the justice system. So it's a great question. There is not a simple answer, but we have emerging principles in law that can help guide us to beneficial use of these technologies.
Okay, thank you very much for the answer, Professor, and Jocelyn, for your question. We have 3 more questions now. The next one is, would you recommend the introduction of online dispute resolution?
All the data that I've seen so far suggests there are tremendous opportunities for online dispute resolution. Yes, it makes sense to me that in a world where I can get a taxi cab with this, I can order my dinner with this, I can connect with businesses and family and friends with this, that why wouldn't I be able to manage certain interactions with the courts with this? So yes, I think we see plenty of data. The British Columbia Civil Resolution Tribunal is an amazing example, a great example of what online dispute resolution can look like. We see more and more courts in the US. We see examples in the United Kingdom. We see examples in China. We see examples in Eastern Europe. We see examples all over the world about, and I think why do we have services and apps and tools like this, right? It's to better serve people, to help them, right? We find it convenient. We find it better. And oftentimes when people have trouble with the courts, it's for very basic things like failing to appear for a hearing. For some people, it's very difficult to appear for the hearing. They have to take time away from work. They have to get childcare. And how can we use online dispute resolution and technology to lower the barriers, right? The vast majority of people want to do the right thing. And so how can we set up systems that make it easier for them to do the right thing? So yes, I'm a big fan of online dispute resolution and its promise.
The next question is, how can we start teaching technology to the judiciary?
Programs like this are wonderful. I was so happy to have this opportunity. I think that there are, we can continue to build the body of knowledge. And I think the Justice Lab here is another great example of that. If you have people like Dariel and Jose who's working with you thinking about how do we bring the information together? How do we create high quality programming? How do we create programming that really understands what the justices need, what they, the problems they're dealing with and what is actually relevant for what they're doing? So I think that, we're seeing more and more programs to try to train. I mean, this is a challenge in law schools even, to try to train the law students, today's law students, so they bring that better knowledge. But it's going to be an ongoing thing, right? I think that law changes, and of course, as lawyers and judges, we monitor the law, but the law tends to change relatively slowly, whereas technology moves fast. And of course, so that will continue to be a challenge. And I think that programs like this are wonderful. So I'm excited to have that opportunity, and I think we'll have to see more and more training for lawyers, judges, other professionals. We're seeing this across all industries, that professionals need continuing education to learn about these things. And so for people like me, the goal is to make the education better and better so that it's enjoyable and not too painful. And we need willing learners who want to learn because they understand the potential for technology to have such a positive impact and to help us achieve the goals that we have for the justice system.
And the last question we have, is it essential to define quality processes before automating and implementing artificial intelligence in our justice institutions?
So the question is about making sure we improve our processes before we use technology. Yeah. So Bill Gates is famous for having said that if you apply technology to a bad process, you just magnify, the bad outcomes. And so if you really want to use technology to help improve, to get better outcomes, you have to first have a process that you understand and that is capable of generating good outcomes. So without a doubt, it is really, really important to think about those processes and to really understand what are the problems. This goes back to some of the earlier questions too about, sometimes we get a tool, artificial intelligence, and it's like, what can I do with this, right? It's like our hammer and everything's the nail, right? And process improvement, design thinking, it helps us really understand what the problem is, because some of the biggest mistakes we make is we think we know what the problem is, we jump to a solution, and maybe we spend even a lot of money on the solution. And here we don't want to do that, right? We don't want to assume technology can solve the problem. We need to invest resources in understanding processes, understanding the users, the people we serve, right? The people external, the citizenry, but then the people in the justice system, the judges and court clerks and administrators and everyone, understand them and their needs, understand the problems, understand our systems and processes, and then think about how technology can solve some of the problems that we identify, right? So it has to start with our processes for sure.
Well, thank you, Professor. Thank you for answering all the questions. I think that I speak by myself and by all the participants, we have learned so much. We have learned a little bit about the myths and the benefits and the risks of artificial intelligence. I must say that I'm one of the person who gets a little bit scary when speaking about artificial intelligence and the possibility of replacement, but thanks to you, I'm a little bit more at peace. And thank you so much for your time. Thank you for joining us in this space. En español, dado el gran desarrollo de la inteligencia artificial, sus repercusiones y proyecciones para el futuro, para un futuro tal vez no tan lejano, es importante que se creen y se generen este tipo de espacios de reflexión.
It's important to have this type of spaces where we can reflect and know, gain knowledge, and deepness about the benefits, the risks, about the implementation of the artificial intelligence, and specifically in the judiciary. Now we'll have the words of Mr. Dariel Suarez for the final words. Thank you, Professor, and all those of you who have been with us in this webinar.
Muchísimas gracias. Gracias, magistrada, y
Thank you,
gracias.
Maestrada. Thank you, Professor Linna.
Muchísimas gracias. Creo que realmente ha sido una muy enriquecedora conferencia, sobre todo porque nos pone en perspectiva qué es el objetivo del Laboratorio de Innovación para la Justicia de nuestra Escuela Nacional de la Judicatura, lo que está sucediendo en el mundo. Y la experiencia del profesor Linna es realmente amplia, como vimos en su experiencia.
The experience of Professor Linna is really wide. And overall, a question that I think is very interesting for those development countries like Dominican Republic, and most likely is the case of other countries where some of the participants come from. We asked if this was interesting, and I think the answer is yes. These are topics that we need to be talking in countries and development. It's fundamental to see how technology helps to eliminate the barriers for justice. And I'm convinced that not only for Dominican Republic and all our brothers and sisters around the world, all the efforts that we can make to better for the betterment of the process and the justice system so that it could be more accessible, it's going to be a very good decision for developed countries like the United States as well as for our country. We're so thankful for Professor Lina, and we're happy that this initiative of the lab can contribute to generate a space for the discussion of topics that can help the justice that is more centered in the citizen and rethink our profession. We invite you to stay tuned on our YouTube channel. Is accessible through subtitles and the simultaneous interpretation that we've had. We wish you a really good rest of the day. Thank you.